My dad believed his wife over me, gave away my education fund, then learned she. I'm 23 now, but 5 years ago, I was just an 18-year-old finishing high school and gearing up for college. My name is Lily, and I used to live in a suburban town outside of Chicago with my dad, Robert, and his new wife, my stepmom, Becky. At first glance, we seemed like a normal, blended family. Dad was a steady provider, Becky tried to appear supportive, and I was a teenager, just trying to find my footing before heading off to college. But one day, everything crashed around me. Becky accused me, out of nowhere, of stealing her jewelry. Not just a single piece, but practically her entire jewelry box, claiming I'd sold it all for quick cash. I remember that initial confrontation like it was yesterday. Becky stood in the living room, tears in her eyes, waving around a couple of receipts that she said proved I'd gone to a pawn shop. She was furious, and Dad believed every word. I denied it, of course. The idea of stealing was beyond me. I had never taken anything in my life, let alone an entire collection of expensive jewelry. Yet, for reasons I still don't fully understand, my father, my extended family, even my grandparents, instantly sided with Becky. They claimed that evidence was overwhelming, from the missing jewelry to some random receipts that Becky somehow found in my room. I begged them to think logically. Why would I need to steal jewelry and pawn it off? I had a college fund set aside for me, one Dad had always promised I could use to pursue my dream of studying out of state. It made no sense for me to sabotage my own future this way. Still, no one listened. Dad confronted me in the kitchen, his face a mix of disappointment and anger. He laid out how Becky had discovered her empty jewelry box, how she'd supposedly tracked down the pawnshop visits, and how she felt so betrayed. My protests fell on deaf ears. He'd say, "I know this is hard, Lily, but Becky has no reason to lie," which cut me deeper than he probably realized. My aunt and uncle, who lived nearby, came over that evening, and I saw the disgust in their eyes. They shook their heads, muttering about how they couldn't believe I'd stooped so low. Within a matter of days, I became the family pariah. What hurt the most was that Dad made an even bigger statement than just throwing me out. He took away the education fund he'd been saving for me and gave it to Becky to make up for her losses. As if that wasn't enough, Becky publicly refused to press charges, earning admiration from my relatives for her so-called grace. They all insisted I got off easy, that I could have gone to jail. The entire narrative was flipped. Becky was the victim, I was the sneaky thief who needed to learn a lesson. So, at 18, I found myself suddenly alone, disowned by a family I had trusted. My mom lived in another state, and because she and Dad hadn't parted ways amicably, I never had a strong connection with her side of the family, either. She also took Becky's word as truth, convinced by all the evidence. With no funds for college, no emotional support, and nowhere to go, I crashed on a friend's couch until I could figure something out. Those early days were surreal. I'd walk around numb, replaying every moment in my head, asking myself how this could have happened so fast. One minute I was excited about college visits, the next, I was job hunting to cover rent and groceries, trying not to break down under the weight of betrayal. And that's how my life went on for the past 5 years. Until now, when, out of the blue, Dad and the rest of them reappeared, claiming they'd learned the truth and wanted me back in the family. But the damage was done. Thinking back on how the entire conflict started still makes my heart race. I remember it vividly. One Saturday morning, Becky, my stepmom, stormed into the living room with tears in her eyes, clutching a handful of receipts she claimed to have found in my bedroom trash can. She waved them around like a prosecutor presenting ironclad evidence in court, announcing that they proved I had taken her jewelry and pawned it for cash. At first, I just stood there in disbelief, staring at her. I'd never even set foot in a pawn shop. Yet she was so certain, so dramatic, it almost felt like I was watching a play instead of my own life. Dad appeared behind her, his face already set in disappointed anger. He asked me flat out if I'd stolen Becky's jewelry. I denied it immediately, of course. But Becky refused to believe me. She shook the receipts, pointing to dates that coincided with times I'd supposedly gone out with friends. "How else would these end up in your trash?" she demanded. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I tried to reason with her. I pleaded with Dad to look at the receipts more carefully, to notice that my signature wasn't on any of them. But the details Becky had pulled together were too convincing in my father's eyes. She had even stashed a couple of missing bracelets in my closet, further proving I'd hidden away some of the pieces. It was horrifying to realize she'd gone to such lengths to frame me. Instead of investigating or questioning me further, Dad took Becky at her word. My grandparents and my aunts and uncles all fell in line just as quickly. It was like watching a domino effect. One relative would gasp at the evidence, and the next would shake their head and declare how ashamed they were of me. Within hours, everyone believed I was a thief. No one thought to ask how I could have sold so many items without leaving a proper paper trail. Or why Becky had never heard me admit to anything during phone calls with friends. She tried to claim she overheard me bragging, but never provided actual proof. I tried to plead my case, but it was useless. Every effort I made only seemed to deepen their conviction that I was lying. The final blow came when Dad decided that my college fund, the money he had saved for me to attend my dream university, would instead go to Becky. He rationalized it as compensation for the jewelry, which she valued far more than the actual appraisals would have suggested. He told me it was my punishment for what I'd done and a lesson in responsibility. In that moment, my future plans of leaving our suburb for a good school out of state evaporated. The days that followed were some of the darkest I've ever experienced. Friends from high school were celebrating acceptance letters, while I sank into a pit of shame and anxiety. One by one, my relatives stopped answering my texts, treating me as though I were contaminated. I wanted to scream at them that they'd been duped, that Becky was behind this entire fiasco. But no one would listen. My mental health plummeted. Most mornings, I woke up feeling like a heavy weight was on my chest, my mind racing with thoughts about how unfair it all was. I slept on a friend's couch for a while, trying to figure out how to survive without my father's support or the college fund I'd counted on. The guilt and sadness twisted into a kind of numb depression. Every day, I had to remind myself to eat, to keep looking for any job that would at least cover rent once I moved out of my friend's place. And that was my life for the next several years, existing in survival mode, devastated by the betrayal of the very people I'd counted on most, all thanks to a web of lies spun by my stepmom. Looking back, I realize I suffered not just from the lost opportunities, but from the stifling feeling that no one believed in me. Becky's phony proof had been enough to ruin my reputation and sever my family bonds. 5 years later, I'm still picking up the pieces of a life that was shattered in a single weekend of accusations. For the next 5 years, I lived as though I'd been dropped into a completely unfamiliar world, alone and without a safety net. When I left Dad's house, it was clear that no one from the family intended to lend me a hand. My grandparents wouldn't respond to my calls, uncles and aunts stopped inviting me to any family gatherings, and even my older cousins, who'd once been like siblings, acted like I was a stranger. All because my stepmom, Becky, had convinced them I was a thief. At 18, with no college fund and no moral support, I was forced to rely on my friends. Thankfully, one of my best friends at the time, Kara, allowed me to crash on her couch. Her parents were sympathetic, but they weren't in a position to pay for my education or take on my living expenses long term. So the clock was ticking. I had to figure out how to be self-sufficient, and quickly. I spent my days scrambling to find any work I could do. Initially, I balanced a part-time job at a local diner and another short-term gig stocking shelves at a grocery store. It was exhausting, but it put a little money in my pocket. Kara's parents didn't charge me rent, but I knew I couldn't overstay my welcome. After a few months, I'd saved enough to put down a deposit on a tiny studio apartment. It was run down, the walls were thin, and the heating didn't always work, but it was mine. In that cramped space, I felt a small flicker of pride. I was forging my own path without my family's help. Yet the emotional toll was immense. I'd often find myself pausing in the middle of folding laundry or flipping burgers at work, consumed by a heaviness in my chest. The pang of betrayal was constant, like a bruise that refused to heal. I thought about how at just 18, I should have been preparing for college, maybe attending orientation or buying textbooks. Instead, I was juggling back-to-back shifts and fielding suspicious glares from strangers who heard rumors about me or recognized my last name. Apparently, Becky had spun some elaborate tale that I'd fled town in shame after confessing to stealing her jewelry. Sometimes customers at the diner would glance at me and whisper, "My friend who worked the same shifts told me," they likely knew the rumors. It was a crushing sensation, to be scorned by the people who should have stood up for me. My father and grandparents had turned their backs precisely when I needed them most. Part of me expected at least one of them, my grandmother, maybe, to realize something was off, to challenge Becky's story. But no one did. No one even bothered to check on me. I wasn't just humiliated, I felt deeply hurt. These people had known me since I was a child. They'd celebrated my birthdays, cheered at my softball games, and told me they loved me. Yet the minute Becky provided her proof, they all believed I was capable of such a horrible act. That first year, I battled a deep depression. Waking up some mornings, the weight of my family's betrayal felt so heavy, I'd wonder how I could keep going. My dreams of going to college out of state slipped away bit by bit. I couldn't afford tuition, and the burden of full-time work left me with little energy to contemplate night classes or community college. Even in the darkest moments, I clung to the small triumphs, paying the electric bill on time, saving an extra $100 at the end of the month, forging new friendships with coworkers who didn't judge me for a scandal they knew nothing about. And so, day by day, I inched forward, creating a life without the people who'd once been my entire world. It wasn't easy, but each small success reminded me that I was stronger than Becky's lies, and stronger than the family who had abandoned me for them. 5 years into my new life, things were finally getting easier. I was living in a small but comfortable apartment and had managed to land a decent job that paid enough for rent and occasional treats. Sure, it wasn't the grand future I'd once planned back when I'd expected to go to college, but it was a life I'd built from scratch. Day by day, I felt less haunted by my family's betrayal. Then, out of nowhere, they all tried to contact me. I remember the day vividly. My phone started buzzing with unfamiliar numbers, and emails poured into my inbox from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. At first, I ignored them, assuming some new drama had surfaced. But the messages kept coming, each more urgent than the last. When I finally opened one of the emails, my jaw dropped. It was from my aunt, of all people, practically begging me to read her explanation. She wrote that my father, Robert, had recently uncovered evidence that proved Becky, my stepmother, was the real thief. Apparently, Dad had been using Becky's laptop while his own was in for repairs, and he stumbled upon an email thread detailing the sale of her jewelry. The email thread mentioned a final unsold piece and asked if Becky wanted to buy it back. Dad recognized the piece as one of the so-called stolen items, a set of distinctive earrings Becky had loudly mourned as lost. It turned out Becky herself had sold her entire jewelry collection years ago and orchestrated fake pawn shop receipts, planting them among my things to frame me. At the time, Dad hadn't considered that Becky's proof was too convenient and circumstantial. He was blinded by her emotional accusations and never thought to question them. Once he discovered the truth, he confronted Becky. She tried to spin more lies, claiming she'd done it to protect him from me, that I was a gold digger bent on draining his finances. But none of it stuck anymore. The final straw was how Becky had accepted my college fund as compensation for damages. Dad realized how she'd manipulated him into punishing me financially for a crime I never committed. In a matter of hours, Dad kicked Becky out of his house. My father, who had been so convinced of my guilt he'd disowned me, was now furious at her for destroying our family. News of Becky's fraud spread quickly through my relatives. Suddenly, every single one of them realized I'd been telling the truth the entire time. The so-called evidence Becky had found was a sham, and they had all been complicit in my exile. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. A cousin called me 3 times, leaving voicemails explaining how sorry everyone was. My grandparents wrote me a lengthy email, begging for forgiveness. Even friends who distanced themselves reached out to see if I was okay. It was like the world had flipped again, but this time in my favor. Yet, as I read through these messages, all I could feel was a complex mix of anger and relief. Yes, relief that my name was finally cleared, that I wasn't the monstrous thief they'd painted me to be. But the anger was there too, seething at how they could have believed someone they barely knew over their own flesh and blood. I was 18, and they discarded me without a second thought. I couldn't help but wonder, if Dad hadn't accidentally discovered Becky's incriminating emails, how much longer would they have let me carry this false guilt? How much of my life had I lost, because they'd chosen to side with someone who turned out to be a manipulative liar? In a single day, they'd offered me the vindication I'd prayed for years ago, yet it felt hollow. I knew the consequences of their actions couldn't just vanish. The father who kicked me out, the grandparents who never bothered to check on me, did they expect a warm welcome back into my life now that the truth was revealed? There I was, standing at the precipice, the truth was out, and my family finally recognized my innocence. But the damage? It was already done. With Becky's scheme exposed, the fallout was immediate and unforgiving. Once word spread that she had orchestrated the entire jewelry theft hoax, her credibility evaporated. My father, Robert, threw her out of the house, and the rest of the family swiftly followed suit in distancing themselves. Suddenly, the woman who once held such sway over everyone had nowhere to turn. She tried staying with distant relatives, only to be met with turned backs and skepticism. After all, who would trust the woman who'd sacrificed her own marriage and my future to frame me? It didn't take long for her to vanish from my family's radar entirely. My relatives were too busy reeling from the realization that they'd all been duped so easily. The same people who'd condemned me without a second thought were now scrambling to make amends. My phone began buzzing with calls and texts from my dad, grandparents, and even my mom, who had lived in another city and cut me off back when the accusations first surfaced. Their messages carried a familiar theme: remorse. They admitted they'd been blind, too quick to believe Becky's staged evidence. They insisted that 5 years ago, they'd only sided with her because of how convincing she was, never fully pausing to consider my record of honesty or my desperation to clear my name. Now that Dad had stumbled upon indisputable proof of Becky's lies, he and everyone else wanted to come together and rebuild what was lost. But what they failed to realize was that they hadn't just cost me a place to live. They robbed me of the chance to attend college on a fund I'd counted on since I was a child. They deprived me of emotional support during a pivotal stage of my life, leaving me to fend for myself at 18. None of them had thought to investigate further or show me even a fraction of the understanding they claimed to give Becky. It felt impossible to simply nod and say, "It's okay. Let's pretend none of this happened." I read through their apology texts and emails, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and perhaps the tiniest stirrings of relief. At least I wasn't the villain anymore, my name was cleared. But that didn't erase the nights I'd spent couch surfing, the anxiety of working 2 jobs, or the hurt of believing I was unwanted by my own flesh and blood. One evening, my dad sent a particularly heartfelt email, confessing that he felt guilty for letting Becky con him so easily. He wrote that he was willing to do anything to make it up to me, even refunding a college education if I wanted to go back to school. My mom tried to reassure me that she had always doubted Becky's story deep down, but felt powerless with so many relatives against me. My grandparents apologized for their cold behavior and offered to help me with anything I needed. I won't lie, part of me was tempted. The idea of returning to school, finally pursuing the career I'd dreamt of, glimmered like a lost opportunity suddenly back on the table. But the wounds were still raw. I kept recalling how, at my most vulnerable, they'd let me sink. They hadn't just believed Becky's narrative, they actively participated in condemning me, turning their backs when I needed them most. So here I stand, torn between the prospect of forgiving my family and allowing them back into my life, or continuing forward on my own. The future that once seemed so bleak is brighter now, but do I owe them another chance? Each day, I battle with that question, wondering if I can ever truly heal while maintaining a wall between us. For now, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll come around in time, or maybe I'll never be able to trust them again. All I know is that forgiveness, if it comes, must be on my terms, not theirs. And though it's a decision I'll have to live with, it's also a choice they forced on me the moment they decided to believe Becky's lies. My family's apologies and offers might have felt cathartic had they come earlier, or at least under less contrived circumstances. But 5 years of silence, accusations, and isolation can't be undone with a quick email or a tearful phone call. For too long, I lived under the shadow of my supposed crime, with no one in my corner. Now that my father's marriage is in shambles and my stepmother is fully exposed, they're all desperate to make things right. But is that for my sake or theirs? Dad has gone so far as to say he wants to reinstate my college fund. Apparently, some money is still left, and he's willing to add more to help me start over. The same aunts and uncles who scolded me years ago are saying they'd contribute too, to show they're truly sorry. Funny how they all want to be generous now that the truth is public and Becky's out of the picture. Their sudden change of heart highlights just how little they thought of me before, when I was begging them to believe I was innocent. I've lost count of how many voicemails and text messages I've received urging me to accept the olive branch and let bygones be bygones. But to me, it feels like too little, too late. When I was 18, I needed support, a home, a sense of security. Instead, I got condemnation and a locked door. I needed someone to stand up to Becky and say, "Wait a minute, this story doesn't make sense." No one did. They couldn't even be bothered to do a rudimentary investigation to confirm what she was claiming. And now I'm supposed to smile and say, "No harm done. Let's all be a family again?" The truth is, they did harm me. They deprived me of the education I had been planning for. I missed the chance to attend my dream college, forced to pick up menial jobs instead of developing the skills I'd once dreamed of. I can't deny that the years spent working taught me resilience. I learned how to hustle, how to stand on my own 2 feet. Yet I can't help but feel that I lost precious time, the kind of time you can't get back. And then there's Becky, the mastermind behind my supposed theft. She's gone now, kicked out by my father and disowned by all the same relatives who once praised her for her grace and modesty. I hear she's living in a small apartment in another part of the state, though I don't know the details. The marriage, for all practical purposes, is finished. My father's even talking about filing for divorce. There's a part of me that hopes she'll reflect on the lives she ruined, but I won't hold my breath. When Dad called me recently, I could hear regret in his voice. He mentioned again how terrible he felt for failing me as a father. He said he'd do anything to make it up to me, even if it means draining his savings to pay for the education I never got. But I find that I don't want it anymore, not from him. The price I paid, losing my family, my home, my sense of worth, isn't something money can fix. A college fund won't buy back 5 years of pain and self-doubt. So I made a choice. I told them all, politely but firmly, that I'm not ready to have them in my life. If someday I do forgive them, it'll be on my own terms, when I feel it's right. And if that day never comes, well, that's something they'll have to live with. Because while they may feel ashamed or guilty now, I'm the one who had to rebuild my life from scratch. Part of me hopes they learn from this, that next time they'll ask questions before condemning someone. But I'm not holding on to that hope too tightly. Right now, I'm choosing myself, my own peace, my own future, without the weight of their regrets on my shoulders. In the weeks after my father's desperate phone calls and the family's email apologies, I made one final decision: to block every single one of them on social media. For 5 years, they barely tried to contact me. Then, after discovering Becky's lies, they flooded my inbox with lengthy, collective letters of remorse, pleading for forgiveness and promising to do better. But their sudden outpouring of guilt felt more like a demand than a genuine acknowledgement of what they'd put me through. I read through some of those messages before finally blocking them. They all had a similar theme: we were wrong, we didn't know, please give us another chance. None of them fully acknowledged that they had chosen a stranger's word, my scheming stepmother's, over their own daughter, niece, or granddaughter. They barely touched on how they'd left me to fend for myself at 18. Instead, they talked about how they felt terrible now, how they wanted our family to heal, and how they believed I had to give them an opportunity to make amends. But here's the thing, I don't have to forgive them just because they realized their mistake at last. The weight of the loneliness, the lost opportunities, and the betrayal isn't something that disappears the minute they say, "I'm sorry." And while I'm no longer carrying the same bitterness I felt in those first few years, I'm also not about to let them waltz back into my life simply because it's convenient for them. They made their choices, painful, life-altering ones that derailed my future and left me feeling unwanted. So I typed out my response. A short note stating that I appreciated they'd finally seen the truth, but I wasn't interested in renewing contact. Then I hit send and blocked them all. The sense of relief was immediate, like stepping out of a shadow into clear daylight. My phone went silent from their notifications, and I no longer felt pressured to read their guilt-ridden pleas or debate whether I should give in to their requests. I refused to let their sorrow or embarrassment manipulate me. They might genuinely regret what they did, but regret doesn't erase the damage. It doesn't refund the college fund I lost or the years I spent scraping by, unsure if I'd ever get past the label they pinned on me. To be clear, I'm not out for revenge, I don't wish them ill. I just want the freedom to live my life without the burden of their betrayal dragging me down. That's my final stance. Maybe, down the road, I'll feel differently. But right now, I'm happier on my own. My career is on track, I have friends who stood by me when my own relatives would not, and I'm no longer haunted by the question, why didn't they believe me? The answer doesn't matter anymore, what matters is that I believed in myself enough to start fresh, and that I built a life where I don't have to justify my worth to people who were so quick to discard me. Some might say I'm being stubborn or unforgiving, but after everything, I deserve the autonomy to decide who remains in my life, and under what terms. My father may continue trying to reach out, my grandparents might send another carefully worded letter. But for now, I've made my choice, and that choice is to keep moving forward without them. I'm free from their judgments, their rushed condemnations, and their belated remorse. And you know what? I've never felt more in control of my own future.